This was the coldest winter in European history. The year was 1709. It became known as the Great Frost, and no kingdom suffered more than France. In the first days of January, a bitter wind swept across the land. Peasants woke to find their wells frozen solid. Bread left overnight became as hard as stone. Wine froze in barrels, bursting them apart. In Paris, the River Seine froze over. Children walked upon it, marveling at the ice. Merchants shook their heads in disbelief, their boats trapped at the quay. By the 12th of January, France was a kingdom of ice. At Versailles, the great palace of the Sun King, the cold was felt even through marble and gold. King Louis XIV, now in his 70s, had ruled for more than 6 decades. He was once the most splendid monarch in Europe, a king who had declared, "I am the state." But in January 1709, even the state could not command warmth. Candles flickered in endless corridors, fires roared in massive hearths, yet still water froze in basins. Court ladies complained their ink turned solid before the quill touched the page. Servants carried food on silver platters, only for it to cool before it reached the king. Louis himself, proud and aging, sat wrapped in furs. He who had styled himself the Sun King now felt a chill that mocked his very name. Each morning, ministers brought grim reports. The frost had killed the winter wheat. Cattle were perishing in barns. Snow-choked roads made it impossible to bring grain to Paris. Louis's chief advisors urged him to act. One said, "Sire, the grain reserves must be opened. If we do not feed the people, we will lose them." Another countered, "Majesty, the war in Spain must continue. Without bread for the soldiers, France will fall to her enemies." The king listened, his face grave. The decision weighed upon him like stone. In Paris, hunger grew with every passing day. Crowds gathered outside bakeries. Mothers clutched thin children, begging for loaves. Bakers raised their prices, for flour was scarce. At last, the crowds broke. They stormed the bakeries, smashing windows, seizing bread. Soldiers rushed to restore order, but even soldiers shivered, their breath white in the air. Chronicles speak of riots flaring like sparks, quick and fierce, across the city. Some cried, "The king eats while we starve." Others whispered that heaven itself had turned against the monarchy. In the countryside, the toll was heavier still. Animals lay dead in the fields. Wolves came down from the forests, their eyes glowing in the night, prowling villages in search of prey. Farmers abandoned their homes, walking with families toward the cities, hoping for bread. But the cities had none to give. By the end of that year, historians tell us, 600,000 souls were gone in France alone, more than in many wars. At Versailles, Louis faced his choice. He could open the royal granaries and feed the starving. But to do so would risk his armies, locked in the costly war of the Spanish succession. Without grain, soldiers would desert, France's enemies would triumph. He chose to ration, carefully, reluctantly, but it was never enough. The king's courtiers still dined, though more modestly. Soldiers still received bread, but peasants, the heart of France, felt abandoned. Louis XIV survived that winter. France survived too. But the frost left a crack in the crown. The bond between king and people, once seen as sacred, was weakened. The poor remembered not his victories or his splendor, but their hunger. They remembered the riots, the empty streets, the bodies buried in the slough. That memory would last, and when, 80 years later, revolution came to France, the frost of 1709 was recalled as one of the signs that kings could not protect their people. The Sun King still reigned, but his light had dimmed. The great frost had humbled him. The great frost was expected in the north. France, Germany, and even England had known harsh winters before. But in Italy, the land of sun and olive, the frost came as a stranger. In January of 1709, it crossed the Alps like a silent army. Cold winds swept into the valleys. Night after night, Temperatures fell lower than memory could recall, and soon, the land that had nourished Europe with fruit and oil stood silent beneath ice. In Rome, the sight was unbelievable. The great fountains, gifts of emperors and popes, flowing since antiquity, froze solid. The fountains of Piazza Navona, where sculpted gods once poured streams of water, became still, their streams stiff as glass. Icicles clung to their stone lips, glistening in the pale sun. Even the Tiber River froze, its waters locked in silence. The Romans who walked its banks shook their heads in disbelief. The river had flowed since the days of Romulus. Now it was as lifeless as marble. Priests declared it a warning. They told congregations that God was chastising his people, that the frost was punishment for sin, for vanity, for the wars of princes and the pride of nations. Processions wound through the streets, candles guttering in the cold, prayers rising to heaven. But among the people, doubt stirred. A mother whispered to her child, "What sin did the olive tree commit? Why should the vine be punished?" In Venice, the frost was even more surreal. The lagoon, normally alive with the motion of gondolas and fishing boats, stiffened into sheets of ice. Gondolas, their painted hulls elegant and black, were trapped where they lay. Fishermen stood helpless on the shore, their nets useless, their livelihoods gone. Merchants who had ruled Mediterranean trade for centuries now found their ships blocked by drifting ice in the Adriatic. The city of water had become a city of silence. In the palaces along the Grand Canal, noble families burned costly furniture to keep warm. The poor, huddled in narrow alleys, tore apart doors, shutters, anything that would burn. The frost made no distinction, but the deepest wound lay in the countryside. For Italy's wealth was not only marble and palaces, but its orchards and fields. Olive trees stood across the hills of Tuscany, Lazio and Calabria, some as old as the villages themselves. Citrus groves filled the south with lemons and oranges, their blossoms sweet in spring. Vineyards rolled over the land, heavy with grapes in summer. The frost killed them all. Olive trees split with shacks, their trunks bursting as if struck by lightning. Citrus trees blackened, their fruit ruined. Vines shriveled, their roots frozen in the ground. Farmers walked their land in the mornings, staring in silence. Their fathers had planted these trees. Their grandfathers had pressed their oil. Their children would now inherit only stumps. One chronicler in Naples wrote, "The groves are dead. The hills are silent. The land itself seems cursed." The church preached that the frost was divine punishment. Priests called for confession, for repentance, for humility before God's wrath. In Naples, whole congregations marched barefoot through the streets, begging for mercy. But among the peasants whispers spread. If this is God's will, they asked, why must children freeze? Why must the vine and olive perish? Some turned to anger, others to quiet despair. Faith itself seemed frozen, tested by the same frost that killed the orchards. In the cities, hunger grew. Charcoal sellers doubled their prices. Bread cost 3 times its former worth. Mothers traded rings and earrings for a handful of flour. Fathers begged at church doors for scraps of food. The rich fared better, of course. In Florence and Milan, noble families still dined, though their tables were thinner than before. But for the poor, a crust of bread became treasure. In Naples, children begged in the markets, their hands blue, their voices weak. Merchants turned them away, for their own stores were nearly empty. France lost lives, but Italy lost time. Olive trees, once dead, take decades to grow again. A grove destroyed in 1709 would not feed the farmer's children, nor even his grandchildren. The wealth of generations was erased in a single month of frost. The citrus orchards, too, were gone. For years, the hills of southern Italy bore only blackened branches. This was the cruelest wound. The frost of 1709 was not only a winter, it was the theft of futures. And yet, Italy endured. In Rome, the fountains thawed, the Tiber flowed once more. In Venice, gondolas floated again, nets were cast, and bells rang across the canals. In Naples, seeds were sown in spring, though hands trembled with fear. Families replanted olive shoots. Children carried water to nurture them. They knew they would never live to see those trees full grown, but they planted anyway. The memory of the frost lingered in every story told thereafter. The year when Rome's fountains froze. The year when Venice was silent. The year when the olive died. Italy had been humbled, but not broken. The sun returned, and life, though scarred, began again. By January 1709, England too was frozen. The ground was iron hard. Wells froze overnight. Farmers rose each morning to find their cattle stiff in the stalls. Sheep, caught in drifts, were found frozen in the fields. In London, the poor huddled in doorways, their breath turning white in the air, waiting for alms. Chimneys smoked day and night. Coal burned without pause, yet still the frost crept into every home. And then, as in Paris and Rome, the extraordinary happened. The River Thames froze solid. It was not the first time. In earlier centuries, the Thames had frozen in the Little Ice Age. But by 1709 it was rarer, and when it came, Londoners seized it as both marvel and opportunity. They built the Frost Fair. Stalls were erected on the ice, their planks creaking but holding fast. Tents rose like little villages. Fires burned in barrels, sending smoke into the pale sky. Printers hauled presses onto the river and sold pamphlets boasting they were printed upon the frozen Thames. Alehouses set up tables. Children skated and slid across the ice. Couples walked arm in arm, marveling at the sight. Oxen were roasted whole over great fires. Minstrels played. Jugglers entertained. It was a carnival set upon a river that should have flowed. For a time, London laughed in the frost. But not everyone joined the merriment. Beyond the stalls and music, hunger gnawed at the city. Bread grew scarce. Prices soared. Those with money drank mulled wine on the ice. Those without watched from the banks, their stomachs empty, their feet numb in rags. Children begged along the edges of the fair, reaching out to well-fed Londoners. Some tossed coins, others turned away. One observer wrote, "The Thames was a festival, yet in the alleys nearby, people perished." It was the paradox of the Great Frost. Wonder for some, despair for others. At Whitehall, Queen Anne reigned. A monarch beset by frail health, she faced ministers divided over war abroad and famine at home. Parliament debated poor relief. Should grain be released from reserves? Should prices be fixed? Some argued charity would soften the poor. Others insisted relief was a duty. Coal merchants grew rich as prices rose. The poor, unable to buy fuel, shivered in the dark. The frost revealed more than cold. It revealed division. The rich warming themselves by great fires, the poor dying for want of a lump of coal. Across the Channel in Germany and Switzerland, the frost was merciless. Forests cracked in the night, the sound like cannon fire, as trees split under the cold. Bells in churches froze, their iron stiff, their voices silenced. Families crowded into single rooms, burning furniture, shutters, anything that would burn. Furniture carved by grandfathers, heirlooms of families, turned to ash in desperate fires. In Swiss valleys, peasants abandoned their homes. They walked over mountain passes in search of bread, only to find hunger everywhere. Roads filled with wandering poor, ragged and thin. Entire villages were left empty, never to be resettled. Chroniclers wrote of famine, of fathers trading their last possessions for crumbs, of mothers carrying silent children in their arms. Further north in Scandinavia, the frost struck even harder. Fishing boats lay locked in ice, nets useless. Crops failed, livestock perished. Entire communities faced hunger. Even the Baltic Sea froze, bearing ice along its coasts, halting trade and travel. Merchants who once sailed from Stockholm or Copenhagen now stared at empty harbours. The frost did not spare them. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, all felt its grip. In England, people would later remember the Frost Fair with fondness. They would tell stories of oxen roasted on the river, of pamphlets printed on ice, of laughter in the cold. But alongside those stories, others whispered of beggars freezing in the streets, of mothers watching children waste away, of Parliament debating while the poor starved. In Germany and Switzerland, the frost was remembered not as fair but as famine. In Scandinavia, not as wonder but as ruin. Northern Europe learned, as all of Europe did, that the frost was no respecter of persons. It brought joy to some, misery to many, and a lesson to all, that nature could humble both noble and poor alike. For more than a decade, Europe had watched the Great Northern War unfold. At its heart stood two kings. The first was Charles XII of Sweden. Young, fearless, and brilliant in battle, he had already crushed Denmark, Poland, and Saxony. His enemies called him the Lion of the North. His soldiers marched with pride, convinced that their king could not be defeated. The second was Peter I of Russia, remembered now as Peter the Great. Tall, relentless, full of restless energy, he dreamed of transforming Russia into a modern power. He built fleets, reformed armies, and studied the sciences of Europe. But to rise, he had to break Sweden's dominance in the Baltic. Their clash would decide the future of the North. And in 1709, it would be decided not only by men, but by the frost. In late 1708, Charles XII led his Swedish army into Russian lands. It was a bold invasion, meant to bring Peter to his knees. But Peter knew his country. He avoided battle. He ordered villages burned and crops destroyed ahead of the Swedish march. This scorched earth policy left nothing behind. No grain, no hay, no shelter. Charles pressed forward, confident in his soldiers, even as supplies dwindled. And then, in January of 1709, the frost descended. The cold struck with a cruelty no soldier had known. Swedish troops woke to find their bread frozen stiff. Meat cracked like stone. Wine turned to ice. Powder for their muskets clumped and failed. Horses collapsed in the snow, their ribs sharp beneath their hides. Without horses, the army slowed. Carts were abandoned. Supplies dwindled further. Men wrapped rags around their feet when boots split. Many fell asleep in the snow, never to wake. The march became a trail of bodies, frozen stiff in their armor, staring blankly at the white sky. Peter's men, though suffering too, had the advantage. They fell back into towns prepared for the cold, leaving Charles's army stranded in the wilderness. The frost fought for Russia. In Sweden, Charles had been invincible. In Russia, he was humbled. Reports say he still rode with his men, encouraging them, sharing their hardships. His courage never failed. But courage could not thaw the earth or fill empty bellies. Peter, meanwhile, grew stronger. He supplied his men, rebuilt his armies, and waited. He knew time and cold would weaken his foe. The balance shifted, not by swords but by the season. By spring, Charles's army was a shadow of itself. Once 40,000 strong, it had been halved by frost and hunger. Yet Charles, still bold, sought battle. In July of 1709, near the town of Poltava, the armies met. Peter commanded a rebuilt Russian force, drilled and armed in the European style he admired. Charles led men, exhausted, ill-supplied, but still loyal. The Swedes attacked with bravery, but their strength was gone. The Russians stood firm. Cannon fire shook the fields. By the day's end, the Swedish army was broken. Charles himself was wounded, his foot crushed by shot. He fled into exile in Ottoman lands, carried on horseback, his dream of victory shattered. The defeated Poltava was more than a battle lost. It was the end of Sweden as a great empire. For decades, Sweden had ruled the Baltic. Its navy had dominated. Its armies had marched where they pleased. But after 1709, Sweden never regained its power. Russia, on the other hand, was transformed. Peter the Great's victory, aided by frost, marked the beginning of Russia's rise. From then onward, Russia was counted among the great powers of Europe. Historians would later say, Charles was defeated by Peter, yes, but first he was defeated by the frost. The great frost of 1709 had broken not only peasants and kings, but armies and empires. When people spoke of that winter, they remembered not only frozen rivers and starving villages, they remembered how nature had turned the course of a war. The frost had been Russia's ally. It had humbled the Lion of the North. It had raised Peter the Great to triumph. And in its silence, it had reshaped the map of Europe for centuries to come. By March of 1709, the ice began to loosen. Snow slid from rooftops in heavy sheets. Rivers cracked and groaned, then burst open, sending ice drifting downstream. Birds returned cautiously, their songs strange after such silence. Europe breathed again. But the thaw revealed ruin. Fields lay barren, seeds killed in the ground. Barns were empty, animals gone. Orchards stood as skeletons, black and brittle. Villages were quiet, too quiet, for many doors would never open again. The frost had passed, but famine followed in its wake. In France, the toll was greatest. 600,000 dead, more than in many wars. Families had been wiped out, villages emptied. The riots of Paris were still remembered. Mothers breaking bakery windows, soldiers facing their own neighbors, hungry men shouting, "Bread! Bread!" Louis XIV, the Sun King, lived on, but the frost had dimmed his image. For decades he had been seen as invincible, almost divine. Now his people knew he could not protect them. That crack in his crown would never be repaired. When the revolution came in 1789, memories of hunger long past, of winters when kings ate and peasants starved, fueled the fire. Among them, whispering still, was the memory of the Great Frost. In Italy, the loss was not counted only in lives, but in time. Olive trees that had fed families for centuries were gone. Citrus groves were destroyed. Farmers replanted, but they knew an olive tree takes decades to bear again. A grove lost in 1709 would not return in their lifetime. It was poverty that stretched across generations. Children grew up poorer, grandchildren too, because of that one winter. Priests who had preached punishment now spoke of renewal. Bells rang in thanksgiving when the fountains flowed again, but even in joy there was sorrow. Rome would remember the year when its fountains froze. Venice, the year when its lagoon turned to glass. Naples, the year when mothers bartered heirlooms for bread. In England, people remembered the frost fair with fondness. Pamphlets printed on ice became curiosities, treasured by collectors. Old men told grandchildren how they had walked upon the Thames, seen oxen roasted, drunk ale on the river itself. But alongside the laughter, there were other memories. The poor remembered freezing in alleys, begging while nobles feasted. Parliament's debates, coal merchants' greed, and Queen Anne's hesitant relief, all were remembered too. England's story of the frost was one of wonder and inequality, merriment and misery side by side. In Germany and Switzerland, famine drove people from their homes. Whole families migrated, never to return. Some villages never repopulated, left to the forests. The forests themselves carried scars. Chroniclers remembered the sounds of trees bursting in the night, splitting with thunderous cracks. Bells, frozen silent in their towers, became symbols of the winter's silence. The frost here was remembered not as fair or spectacle, but as desolation. In Scandinavia, hunger lingered. Sweden, already crippled by war, was broken further by famine. Families starved, fields failed. Fishing fleets lay useless in frozen harbors. For Sweden, the frost and the defeat at Poltava combined into a single catastrophe, the end of empire. For Russia, the opposite. The frost had been ally as much as enemy. It weakened Charles XII, strengthened Peter, and allowed a new empire to rise. From then onward, Russia would be counted among Europe's great powers. The Great Frost of 1709 did not pass quickly from memory. In France, people told of bread broken with axes, of riots in Paris, of wolves in the streets. In Italy, they told of fountains frozen, olive trees dead, citrus groves gone. In England, they told of fairs on the Thames, of pamphlets printed on ice, of beggars perishing nearby. In Germany and Switzerland, they told of forests cracking, bells frozen, villages lost. And in Russia, They told of Poltava, of how the frost itself fought for the Tsar. Generations later, grandparents still told children. There was a winter when birds fell from the sky, when wine froze, when even kings were powerless. The frost humbled kings. Louis XIV, who called himself the Sun, was shown to be mortal. Charles XII, the Lion of the North, was broken. It starved nations. Hundreds of thousands died, millions suffered. It reshaped empires. Sweden declined. Russia rose. And yet, it also revealed endurance. Families shared what little they had. Priests opened stores for the poor. Neighbors burned furniture together, huddled by the same flame. Farmers replanted groves they would never live to see bear fruit, planting not for themselves, but for their children. This was the coldest winter in European history. This was the Great Frost of 1709. It humbled kings. It broke empires. It scarred nations. And it reminded all who lived through it that nature, in a single season, can change the course of history. But it also reminded them of hope. For even after the hardest winter, spring will come. And so, in time, it did.